Okay, folks, I am here a bit early, and just give me a few seconds here. We have about 5 minutes here. Unfound on the ground number 13, and excuse me to fix that. I'll do the usual formal introductions once we begin. And so, if there's any sound problems or anything where any technical issues along the way, please speak up. I'm going to begin with the texting here of the usual disclaimers to have that out there before I read it. So give me a moment there while I get these. Hope everyone's doing well. If you're tuning in now or you tune in when this is recording, we're just in a few minutes of our pregame before we officially begin. Hello, Charlotte. Hello, Charlotte. Okay, folks, hope everyone is doing well. I am now turning this off. We still have about 3 minutes. And so, giving some folks here a chance to join us with YouTube. Once you go live, you go live. So we're out here, and this is okay. As always, we thank Natasha and the team for their good support, and both on the content side and the technical side. Of course, Ed Denzel is the boss and proprietor and lead voice of Unfound. Unfound on the Ground is a collaboration effort. We're in episode 13, hard to believe. And we're missing persons in Native American communities. Again, we'll get going in about 3 minutes. And then I'll go forward with the usual formalities as folks join us. I'll go ahead and post the Data Gems link. So that's up there. This is the list, the link of our ongoing resources behind, again, not because of Natasha or Ed or the team, but me. But nice thing about using YouTube here is with the running chat, I can share some resource links as we go. So now real time, as they say in the video, we have those in the chat. And of course, the chat does replay once this does get posted, when Natasha and Ed post this as a available to the public link. We have about 2 minutes till we officially start here. If you're joining us early, again, welcome. We've already said hello to Charlotte. And we will have some other folks here soon. Feel free to, when you drop in, to say hello. Hello, how are you? Welcome. Yes, it's a very important topic, as I'll acknowledge when we get started. Although this is a topic that's on our minds. Actually, in the last episode, when we were talking about legislation, Delane had mentioned Native American communities. So that sort of in our ongoing mix of ideas. Hello, Linda. Prioritize this for us, and we worked it into the mix. So it is 7:30 p.m. my time in the Mountain Time Zone, 9:30 p.m. Eastern. So I'm going to just begin with the usual overview and disclaimers as folks get going, and give folks a few minutes to get here. Missing persons in Native American communities. This is Unfound on the Ground number 13. This will be recorded, this episode, video and audio, including the text chat. Chat participation is an option. For the journalistic, promotional, and or commercial purposes of Unfound, The audio and video recording, including text chat of this digital meeting, will be distributed by Unfound. By participating in this digital meeting, you agree to give Unfound permission to use the rendering of your words for journalistic, promotional, and/or commercial purposes with no compensation to you from Unfound, its assistants, its affiliates, its partners, etc. I have that disclaimer posted right in the text in the live chat. Welcome again, Unfound on the Ground number 13, Native American, missing persons in Native American communities. I'm Eric Grabowski. I'm part of the Unfound assisting team. I've been a guest on Unfound, and I, along with the team, have Delane, continued to push forward on this effort. Thanks to the think tank folks for participating in these episodes and sharing feedback and ideas. I am in academia as in the area of communication, and so beyond my teaching and study of human communication, I do some cold case journalism on the side. As always, my words tonight don't necessarily reflect the views of my employing institution. Feel free to give your own disclaimers as needed. TheUnfoundPodcast.com, TheUnfoundPodcast.com. I have, of course, the Data Gems link there in the chat, which is our running list of resources, particularly reflecting episodes. I want to thank again Delane, mentioning in our last episode 12, our discussion of legislation, the issue of Native American missing persons. It's something certainly that continues to be on the minds of folks, but that mentioning in the last episode accelerated that for us, and this is something we wanted to work into the mix of episodes. So thanks to Lane. I like to mention again some resources in general. I have mentioned this in the past. Sometimes I know around here I see a card with the phone number 1-888-373-7888, 1-888-373-7888, and that's the Human Trafficking Hotline.org. I've mentioned this before. And it is the website, humantraffickinghotline.org, seems to be a good resource. And they are facilitate ways of reporting activities, suspicions, etc., of helping those who are victims of human trafficking. Again, we're all about resource sharing and prevention and helping folks as much as we are about solving cases. So that's important to mention. So get that out there like usual. Again, theunfoundpodcast.com. If you're watching this now or you're watching this when it's distributed after recording, if you're new to Unfound or not, visit the website, theunfoundpodcast.com. Share it, go to it. A lot of great things on Unfound. Obviously, the podcast episodes are the guiding framework of the bigger platform, and so many other good things, including this Unfound on the Ground. Welcome back, folks. I sent out the guiding questions. This is a very important topic to discuss. Of course, with the Gabby Petito situation, which every case in and of itself is important. Okay, and like with the legislation discussion, there are all sorts of legitimate discussions and differences of viewpoint on the politics of all this. Our interests, of course, are the cases itself, accuracy tied to the cases, the people, the families, and so forth. But the reality is, of course, is that sometimes certain cases bring other types of cases to attention. Certainly with the Gabby Petito situation that's been unfolding, consistently on media, that has pointed toward larger, concerns or discussions about, in places like Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, right where I'm at, and so forth about cases of Native American persons. When we're talking about missing persons in Native American communities tonight, of course, that could include situations within or on reservation communities, but that also certainly can include, just like any other group, people that might be anywhere, right, outside, in the case of Native Americans off the reservation. Also, and we're going to focus a lot of our discussion tonight specifically on the United States of America. Let's keep in mind, and I was reminded about this when I was chatting with a person who's interested in these sorts of issues or general issues of crime journalism, but not necessarily in our Unfound loops. But he had just mentioned, that North America, missing persons, Native Americans, particularly Native American women, although it's women and men, North America, Canada, right? And of course, I thought about that more. Certainly South America, too. So, Mexico, South America, North America, right? The whole region, really everywhere. But with regard to the United States of America and the surrounding areas, Central South America, right? There are these cases of Indigenous persons, Native American persons, and so forth. Regardless of the terminology, the issues are similar. So, as always, we want to jump in with some getting some involvement from some of you who are here. Again, if there are any technical issues that happen, if you can't hear me clearly, if there are any problems, please let me know. So again, thanks for Delane for putting this issue more front and center on our radar last episode when we were talking about legislation. There are lots of cases, sometimes some more prominent than others. I obviously have some ideas or some examples I found, but I'll ask those of you in the audience first to get this started. Are there any specific missing persons cases from Native American communities that you would like to discuss? And I'll let folks volunteer that instead of calling on folks. I have some examples, of course, and that I'll jump through as we go. Okay, Linda. Yeah, and there are so many, it's hard to keep up. Sometimes we hear of missing persons cases, and especially if we're keeping in tune with them, we don't necessarily always know every attribute. Obviously, sometimes the idea of being tied to Native American communities might get specific focus, right? For sure. As I was scanning through, these discussions about Native American communities, obviously a number of cases comes to mind. Obviously, the FBI's website can be a good website for some of those resources when they're involved, but let me get that one in particular. Mary Johnson or Mary Davis, right? There was a discussion there reported on USA Today, and this one goes back to, this is a case where the FBI is offering a reward. As I was going through this, let me say too, just like with any set of missing persons cases, we'd like to talk about everything, right? Cleo. Okay, thank you, Delane. So it originated in Canada, if I'm understanding that correctly, but then ended in the United States. And the girl's name was Cleo. And Delane, do you mean that by ended they were able to figure out that she ended up in the United States, alive or dead, or is that still being investigated, Delane? And I'm just Cleo. So Mary Johnson, or Mary Davis, as she's sometimes known. This one got some visibility because of the discussion of a reward. And again, as I'm looking through all these cases, I'd love to talk about all of them because it's important. We want to help anyone that's gone missing and help their family. So I'm being selective. Certainly, there are so many more cases. As always, we should be motivated to continue to study these cases more and share the word. Charlotte, I'm interested in the missing persons, Ashley Long, heavy runner. I've listened to the whole podcast about Cleo. It was sad. Again, Charlotte, Cleo, Delane. CBC has a great podcast on that. She was found deceased. Okay, that's unfortunate. Sad. Thank you for sharing that. And so this Mary Johnson, Mary Davis case pertains to, and as always with these FBI, they have a poster on there, and you can see that this is connected to Washington State and the Tulalip Tribal Police. Mary was traveling to a friend's house and never arrived. She was reported missing December 9th, 2020. So it looks like that they're thinking that whatever happened in about November, right? So that's Mary Johnson. Spent a little time, and again, would like to certainly talk about as many cases as we can, but I would encourage us, all of us, to continue to, on our own, discover as many of these as we can. We have the Tina Marie Finley. Again, this case was connected to Idaho, 1988, and there is some FBI reward tied to this case, at least on this information page. $10,000, Tina Marie Finley. Tina Marie Finley, a 25-year-old member of the Coeur d'Alene, Idaho tribe of Indians, has been missing since March 1988. She was last seen in Plummer, Idaho, and was reported missing days later. The investigation suggests she may have been the victim of foul play. And we have, Ed has shared something, or that was me. I'm sorry. I apologize. That's from the channel. That's me sharing it. I'm still getting used to this new format, folks. Yes, Charlotte, Delane, the life, the heritage. Okay, this is important. And as we see from some of these stories, and we see that magnified specifically through the Native American community's discussion, but with any community, the culture, the family, this sort of shakes folks up, hopefully raises awareness. I also mentioned here Antoinette Christine Caedeto, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing this. This is a case that goes back to, we're here, she was born in New Mexico, and she's biracial listed, Native American and white, particularly of Italian descent. And last seen in New Mexico, Gallup, New Mexico, 1986. 1986, right? And I'll mention one more here. Laverda Sorel, and again, if I'm mispronouncing, my apologies. Here, Sorel's husband reported his wife had been missing since July 4th, 2002, when he dropped her off at an office in Fort Defiance, Arizona. A family member reported her missing to the Navajo Police Window Rock District on July 8th, 2002. And again, I'm getting these items from the FBI website. Okay. So we have, there are just so many cases. And again, many of these cases have rewards. Through the FBI, of course, you can submit tips and other law enforcement agencies. Of course, getting the information to the right people is important. As you know, when we hear these stories of the specific missing persons, as well as some of the issues, the resource issues, you hear a lot about awareness and raising awareness when you're going through these cases, that's a challenge. I mean, these are some heart-wrenching stories, and it is true. I have to say for myself, growing up in Western Pennsylvania, of course, in the Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, West Virginia region, certainly there are Native American communities. But growing up around or near in the Pittsburgh area, like I did, it's not exactly near an Indian reservation. It's not as if you don't know persons of Native American descent. But moving to North Dakota, as I did for work years ago now, certainly you're with the region and some of the history in the region and with the geography of the region and where I've been, you do hear and learn more about Native American issues, at least from my experience. Both folks who live on and off the reservation. And so certainly, from your American history, various things that have happened in this area. And again, as always, there can be very legitimate debates and discussions about how best to address these issues. But I think reasonable people can all agree of goodwill that there are real issues to deal with in terms of resource allocation, and awareness, and as we see with some of the discussion, navigating, different jurisdictions and, good communication and crisis management situations. So, I think however those things end up getting addressed, and certainly we have some discussion tonight about legislation and or government activity, it's important that these things are at least thought about or discussed. This delay and that seems to be a problem. The cases are mostly handled by tribal law enforcement and not by outside law enforcement organizations. Yeah, so we're dealing with resource allocation issues, coordination issues, because sometimes the crimes, if there are crimes involved, they may not always, they could originate on or off the reservation, and it could involve situations or persons that are crossing multiple jurisdictions. But here, many of these stories are certainly heart-wrenching, and there was in the Today program, and I'm posting the YouTube link here, and this was back August 2021, and talking about some of these issues specifically to the family of Arden Peppian, who's been she's been missing for months, and last I checked, after watching this story, still not found. There's, as you'll see if you watch that clip, there's certainly the caregiver who was the last person to see her, basically under this person's care, babysitting, whatever, has had a specific charge, not any charge about specific murder or assault, but having to do with the quality of care or negligence. And I'm not using the exact terminology. And it's last I see, and there's some mention of that in that clip, pleading not guilty, I believe. But they're still looking for the body. They're still looking for more story as to what actually happened. Linda, okay, so for such a lack of trust of outsiders, Linda, I read that reservations lack law enforcement officers, and it seems they don't care with work with outside agencies. Charlotte, yes, and that is so understandable. There are some, as we'll see here shortly, from both federal and in some states. So there's another case, by the way, if I may mention on our, keep an eye on that, Arden Peppian, Arden space Peppian, Peppion, and you'll see in that YouTube link that I just sent out, which is a Today program that keys in, and this is back from August of 2021, toward the end of August, keys in on some of the issues that folks face, and some of it is cultural, communicative, resource, both even within as well as outside the reservation communities. And this is in Montana, right? And which is another state that has obviously a variety of Native American communities, again, both on and off the reservation, Native folks. The story itself, as you start to hear a little bit about Arden's story and the family and what they're doing in terms of organizing, friends and family doing search and where that's. And you can, on your own, search out a little bit about the case. There's some good discussion in there about that case. Linda, I've also read there are jurisdictional conflicts. Yes, and you'll see some of the things that we'll shift into, that this is a real issue. So that the today piece that I've again sent to YouTube, Native Americans grapple with record missing persons. Okay, so we know that's the case. Jurisdictional conflicts are certainly part of the mix. And I'm going to, before I jump into some of the governmental or legislation issues, does anyone else, and I've mentioned some cases here, there are so many. Again, this is just tough. I wish I could feature every missing persons case all the time because we want everyone to be getting attention. And of course, tonight we're focusing on the Native American communities. And so there are so many cases, right? When you start to read the various media reports, and yes, there's certainly academic work being done in these areas, criminologists and so forth, right? There's just so much about it that goes back to the cultural issues and resource allocation Jermaine Charlo is another out of Montana. There is a podcast devoted to her. Delane, if you have, again, no requirement here. If there's anything else you want to say about Jermaine Charlo, CHRLO, and it's in the text, please do so. But just chatting about this issue with Ed and Natasha, who's always insightful on cultural issues, and the team. There's so many issues ongoing that we could be thinking about. And we're going to always, once we get an episode out there with these issues, I know and hopefully you all are noting some of these issues for ongoing research. There's always the possibility of a follow-up or a part 2 and an addendum episode. So certainly, and let's just keep sharing these conversations and resources. There's so many ways in which think tank folks and others who might hear this conversation touch base. And we know that we've learned through our discussions here and beyond that those collaboration pieces are so key. But yeah, they're academics. So, Natasha and the team, particularly Natasha, thinking through some of we've talked about culture, how do maybe some of the, and I've not done all the reading on all this, but there are things I've noted for even beyond tonight's episode, but I'm just raising the awareness of it as we sort through so many important resources, right? Even when you look at, tribal histories and the way in which, specific reservation histories and history, sort of ways in which Native American folks and navigating life on and off the reservation, is there any correlating qualitative or quantitative data about how that might relate to missing persons, and a host of other questions. But I can say, right, they're both for academics and journalists and, well, let me add to that, everyday citizens. There's so many different avenues and angles that we can put on this material. So there's so many questions. So Jermaine Charlo, we have that noted for the record as another important one. I'm going to skip to resources and organizations, and then we're going to come back to the to discuss some legislation or again, federal and state. And some of the legislative aspects might show up here along the way, just on some of these resources. But there's a private group that volunteered to assist in the search for what happened to her. This is Delane. Law enforcement in the area are assisting in some capacity. So really, we're back to some of the issues that we've even talked about, right, with some of our own episodes in terms of work, volunteer work, best practices for search, the importance of people to be involved. What are those things to think about when you're involved in a search? The importance of people stepping up to the plate to be helpful. What are the ways to actually be helpful in a search? But yeah, it's important for people to step up to the plate Obviously, we all want to be advocates and raise awareness about these cases. But when it happens to us, anyone, and it hits close to home for a family or for their community, having a range of people step up to the plate to be helpful is certainly meaningful. You see that in many of these stories, both and on off, within and outside of Native American communities. Thank you, Delane, and everyone for these ongoing comments. They're helpful. Again, this is an important topic for us to be thinking about. Again, there's a couple there's various resources out there. A long time ago when we were talking about resources in general, right? We talked about the journaliststoolbox.org, and that's the Society of Professional Journalists puts that together. There are so many different resources on there, and I, when possible, if there's a particular resource that I get on there or it's linked on there. Okay, one in particular, if you're looking for data and discussions about data, crime in general, National Archive of Criminal Justice Data, NACJD, and that's hosted on the University of Michigan, umich.edu website, icpsr.umich.edu, and so forth. And I have the link shared there. It's the Institute for Social Research, University of Michigan. Well, if you go to that, and I'm not going to go into every detail now, just searching for that, you'll see that if there are various, if you go to the search, and whether you search Indian or Native American, you'll see there's various data materials available that are available for study. Now, some of these things aren't necessarily always directly about specific only missing persons, but as we know, with things that are happening with regard to missing persons cases, and even in the area of prevention, which is important, right? When we think about issues of violence and other sorts of things, right? Looking at the big picture of data, quantitative and qualitative, can be helpful. And so just that's important to be aware that, there are reports or data sets and other sorts of things that are available if you go to that website, icpsr.umich.edu / that I've shared on that in the chat. So take a look at when you get a chance. I can't remember if we've talked about that research in our various episodes. Again, it's hard to believe we're in research episode 13, thanks to everyone. But, it is important to be aware of the resources that are out there. One of our favorites we've talked about a few times, missingkids.org. Missingkids.org. They have a section there, resources and technical assistance for Native American communities and Indian country. And so and I'm just reading right from their website, just a sentence here. When a child goes missing, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, is here to help with our full range of technical assistance and resources available at no cost to local jurisdictions and families. And so on that page, you'll see a number of resources, even some of those partnerships or collaborations, some of which comes under government, and some doesn't. But and you'll see even relating to some of the legislative items that we've talked about last time or that we could be mentioning tonight, of course, in terms of resources and resource sharing and communication and so forth. There's a flyer there. I would suggest if you're interested in related issues tied to the Native American communities or you're doing any sort of study or case study or studying cases or sharing cases or trying to raise awareness, as always, the missingkids.org material is tremendous. And they even have a 2021 report there from the Department of Justice, Journal of Federal Law and Practice. And so there's a discussion there about missing or murdered Indigenous persons, law enforcement, and prevention. And you can click. There are a number of resources available on that 2021 report that the missingkids.org featuring. So please check that one out. That's a great resource when we talk about resources or organizations that we want to be attentive to. I have, and let's just, this is an organization, Native Women's Wilderness.org. And again, we're focused in particular on the very important issues tied to raising awareness of missing persons cases, working on prevention. Okay, so that's our focus here. As we look at different organizations that are not specifically missing persons organizations, that doesn't mean we do or don't necessarily endorse other issues or views they might be involved with. We're providing resources and citations for this, but certainly in terms of awareness and advocacy, this is a credible organization and website, and you'll see some statistics there and some discussions about policy and so forth. And again, we'll be talking about that, but you can see they're trying to raise awareness, and no surprise nowadays, and we've seen this for a while outside of this site, right? In social media, if you're on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, people trying to raise awareness. This organization, seems to be, involved in various aspects of that, those sets of issues tied to the importance of being aware of what's happening with missing persons in Native American communities. Another list here, and this has some legislation on this site, which we'll talk more about here, but Association on American Indian Affairs since 1922, according to their website. The page I've shared here has some things pertaining to legislation. Of course, you'll see North Dakota mentioned there. Those bills, just check them out a bit with tracking aspects or versions, or those bills did more or less go through. So you could see they deal with they deal with enforcement, resource allocation, information sharing, data, right? And this is important for dealing with issues of human trafficking, which of course is not only for Native American communities, but certainly involved in that Native American communities. And again, through the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, parts of Minnesota, right? This is an area with a lot of Native American communities. Another resource that's very good, and this is tied to, this is on a .edu here website, you'll see. And so this is seems to be a hosted with the University Libraries, New Mexico. And so there's discussion here about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so there's a lot of important resources here. Some of them pertain to legislation, which we'll get to. But you'll see reports, specific ways of finding cases. For instance, on the missing persons pages, right? They're linking to specific update pages, Montana, Navajo Nation, lost and missing in Indian country, and so forth. Obviously, importantly, there's discussion there on human trafficking, right? For sure. Organizations, they have Sovereign Bodies Institute, Urban Indian Health Institute, Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, and National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And so again, that libguides.unm.edu and so forth in the URL that I've sent out in the chat. That's a great resource page to add to your own personal toolbox of missing persons and sort of general, issues pertaining to crime or possible crime or study of crime. Again, just to mention, right, as we do once in a while, someone goes missing, that doesn't necessarily mean that a crime has been committed, right? People can choose to disappear, and as long as they're not committing any sort of fraud, so forth, that violates the law, then they're not breaking the law. Now, you could get into all sorts of ethics discussions and so forth, for sure. And again, I'm not a lawyer or not giving legal advice, but pretty basic understanding there, right? That if I can choose to disappear and I want to go somewhere and start a new life, if I'm not committing any sort of fraudulent activity or so forth that violates the law, that doesn't necessarily mean a crime has been committed. Unfortunately, in many of these cases, a crime has been committed, and that's the sad thing. So as much as we want to worry about getting at the truth of these cases, we're also interested in prevention. Anyone else have to add as I start working through some cases, and soon going to jump into some discussions of some legislative and governmental activity pertaining to Native American cases. And please, as always, when I'm sharing these resources, certainly this goes into your own personal toolbox. These are things as a community that we can continue to study and share. You may find resources that you want to share specifically tied to, particular missing persons cases. So please do that. As you sort through material. Another thing I saw discussed, and this is they don't seem to have a ton of episodes, but they did start to have some work. This podcast here, KHQ TV, and this is more towards the Northwest. Please, Delane. If there's anything you wanted to add while I'm waiting for Delane, again, this vanished a Native American epidemic, again, that podcast KHQ TV, they have some material up there, and I've posted their own mentioning or overview of that. Vanished a Native American epidemic podcast examines MMIP issues. And so when you start to talk about issues like Montana, Washington State, Idaho, and so forth, also, again, we're dealing with, Native American communities. And there are lots of, media, a lot of entities out there, television, internet, newspaper, and which, of course, includes digital most of the time nowadays, where there is more focused attention given to the plight of Native American persons gone missing and their families and their communities. So, those materials are out there for sure. So the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from the UNM libraries. There actually is an easier URL for that than I had shared. It's a little easier to remember. And I'm just going to post it here one time. And again, take your time, Delane, whenever you get to that. That's the libguides.unm.edu/MMIW, missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls as a point of focus there. So a lot of resources there, and a lot of those resources pertain to missing men or women. But obviously, understandably, there's a significant focus on missing and murdered women and girls in Native American communities, for sure. I'm going to, and again, take your time, Delane, as you're typing. I'm going to get into some specific items here pertaining to governmental activity. And a lot of this is federal. Some of this, though, we'll see is state. And Well, I'm just getting my resources. I'll check and see here. Delane. Okay. This is not specific. This is Delane, not specifically related to the U.S., but in Canada, there was the big scoop from the 1950s to 1980s. Delane, if that was what, a movement of people, was that a shifts in where people lived, or was that basically people being moved from point A to point B to some extent with or without their consent? And so Linda, and I'll wait for Delane, and then Charlotte, of course, asked the question, was the big scoop where they took the children? Similar to my question. Linda, noise, okay, Northeast Oklahoma, Indigenous Safety and Education. I'm going to check and see this here. Noise. This is one we may want to share right now. Okay. So I'm going to look at Delane. I think it played a very important role in what is still happening in Canada with abuse. Of course, Delane, you're getting into important discussions. Again, people can have some legitimately different analyses of these, but those governmental and cultural factors certainly do play a role in how what sort of the after effects might or might not be going forward. And Linda, I'm looking this up now, and if you have a website, you can share it. And so I'm not going to spend forever to do this, but Northeastern Oklahoma Indigenous Safety and Education. And so this looks to be a group that, and it looks like they have a site here, noiseispower.com. And again, they're focused on a range of issues. And again, I have their about page here. And again, our focus is specifically about missing persons cases and crime and safety and prevention and solving. So we're not necessarily endorsing or not endorsing other sorts of causes or specific, even specific policy solutions necessarily. But we do want to go where people are actually talking about these issues. So thank you for that, Linda. And I just shared what seems to be the link for the organization that you're talking about, Delane. Children basically taken to basically remove their indigenous heritage. And so these become interesting sorts of impacts on cultural history. So I guess the question would be then, how might these sorts of things be playing out today? The Sovereign Bodies Institute, that might have been mentioned in one of the other features. Yeah, Sovereign Bodies Institute. That's the one that was mentioned on the UNM website. And so I have this here. I'm going to, and we'll see, they have reports. And that's sovereign-bodies.org. So they seem to have material that is relevant, and I'm going to go ahead and put that link out there. Again, we're focusing on missing persons issue, crime preventions, and so forth. We're not necessarily endorsing or not endorsing other sorts of political or philosophical statements. But again, we got to go where the discussions are. And yes, we want more people to be having conversations about Native American communities and missing persons. Charlotte, it plays into the Native American people going missing because their whole way of life was taken from them and they don't know who they are. That's an interesting thought. I'm not necessarily going to, there's a lot of nuance. Of course, Natasha's has given us a lot to think about over the episodes in terms of culture. And we think about issues of cultural connection and cultural identity. And you'll see in some of these discussions in media reports, and certainly in academic discussions, about how some of these cultural histories and dynamics might play into how we grapple with, not all, missing persons cases, and then how missing persons cases might be perceived, discussed, handled, and so forth going forward. So this is an interesting discussion. Okay, so thank you for those suggestions or reminders along the way. And so let me continue, and I'll just, if anyone else is here wanting to chime in, I have some other materials here I want to share in terms of materials here. Okay, so let's move some of this together. Let's talk a little bit about some legislative material now. And we've talked some about organization, resources, and of course that doesn't mean there won't be some crossover here for us. Does anyone want to mention, okay, Delane, plus the abuse they suffered, they have perpetrated against their children and spouses. So Delane, are you saying, Delane, that the bad behavior is continued on and passed on, at least in some cases, Delane? That's what I think you're saying. Of course, that happens in a lot of communities, but certainly I think what you're saying, Delane, is that once the ball gets rolling of dysfunction in these communities, and that doesn't mean everyone's dysfunctional, by the way, folks. We're talking about specific people and what they may be going through. That doesn't mean that everyone's dysfunctional in those communities, but there might be certain tendencies there that could get passed on. I think that's what we're saying. Yeah, over time, yes. Please take any links tonight that you think are really important. But although I'm behind on it, not Natasha, not Ed, we are continuing, or will be continuing to adding key items to data gems. But we do have a running list here in the chat. Thank you, Delane, also for answering. So if there's something you really see tonight that's important, run with it, read it, share it, whatever. But yes, over time, we'll continue to have these materials, these references, these resource lists available. For sure. Before I start talking through, does anyone have any legislation that they want to mention, or other governmental activity? I know, and obviously a lot of government activity is tied in some way or another to pieces of legislation and ways in which government collaborates. So I'm kind of saying governmental activity in general, or legislation, or something along those lines. Okay, there's so much out there. I was trying to key in not Invisible Act. Okay, that's one that we have here, which we'll certainly be mentioning for sure. But that's a good one. Yep, Not Invisible Act. Okay, any others? Right, and I'm just going over here to legislation. So we have the Not Invisible Act of 2019. And again, I'm back to the UNM site there. That was a bill to increase intergovernmental coordination to identify and combat violent crime with Indian lands and of Indians. There's also Savannah's Act. You'll see various discussions of that. And this pertains to the Department of Justice, updating online data entry format for federal databases relevant to cases of missing and murdered Indians to include a new data field for users to input the victim's tribal enrollment information or affiliation. And so I'm giving the highlights here. And then also tied to Savannah's Act, the bill directs the DOJ to review, revise, and develop law enforcement and justice protocols to address missing and murdered Indians. And again, I'm using the terminology here that's found in these overviews. Again, I'm on that UNM site that I've been mentioning. IDA's law. Okay, I have that on the list. Yes, some of these bills were under Trump, President Trump. We can see that activity is considering under President Biden. And I have that Association of American Indian Affairs up. They have that legislation page, which is either or mostly completed or passed legislation, possibly at the time it was put together in process, or maybe all completely passed. That's at indian-affairs.org/legislation.html. Okay. And so one of the things that's interesting here, too, and of course, some of this activity, we talk about the American government, obviously, a lot of the actions at the legislative branch. But then when obviously there's certain managerial purviews within executive branch, and there might be certain funding allocations, and certainly regardless of which president's in place, particularly at the federal level, certain executive space to, do certain things. So we have the Department of the Interior getting involved with their own new unit. And this is reported on NPR, April 2021. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, and again, I apologize on the pronunciation. In the and she's the first Native American cabinet secretary in U.S. history. So in that Department of the Interior, there is a unit tied to missing and murdered Native Americans, and I have that out there. So this is yet another government agency. This is looked at to raise awareness, be involved with investigations, think about ways in which different resources can be connected or allocated, right? And again, this is about both solving cases as well of the prevention. And I have a quote here from Secretary, the Interior Secretary, and this is right from the Department of Interior website. This is her quote: "The missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis is centuries in the making. It will take a focused effort and time to unravel the many threads that contribute to the alarming rates of these cases. But I believe we are in an inflection point. We have a president and a government that is prioritizing this, and we can't turn back." So again, we can see that they have a particular focus. Of course, this is under President Biden. Yes, some of these things, excuse me, also certain laws and initiatives were being, activities were being pushed under President Trump. Good to see that it's cross-partisan, right, in terms of how folks are being aware of this. But certainly we know, and you can see on here, the Secretary is implementing the Not Invisible Act, and there's also the Missing and Indigenous Persons Awareness Day, which had already been in place. President Biden had a proclamation about that in 2021. And again, some of these activities had begun already under President Trump. And certainly some of these discussions were happening before Trump, about, in terms of Congress. And I believe even the National Missing Persons Day predates National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day. I think predates Biden. You can read the proclamation. But again, we can say regardless of party or whatnot, and notwithstanding disagreements on specific policy issues, the fact that these things are being discussed, that there are collaborations and attempts to raise awareness, that's important, right? For sure. We also have, and this is one that really is if you go to this website, this is operationladyjustice.usdoj.gov/about. Of course, I have the about added here, so we see what's going on. Operation Lady Justice. And so you can see that this is tied to This is the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so you can go through, some of the usual governmental highlights of who's involved with this. But really what they're doing, and of course, who knows if all these are offered or updated appropriately, but we would hope so. And you could see even on their frequently asked questions page, you can expand some of the material to see what's going on. Over time, we all of us can't keep up with everything all the time, but collectively or as a group, as we keep up on what we can, then we can share information and knowledge about what is going on. Obviously, the Department of Justice is going to be involved in activities pertaining to the solving and prevention of crimes, raising awareness also like the Department of Interior. But obviously with the Department of Justice, that falls more within, what they're doing. And so let me go through here. So we have some federal, state level, you're seeing some activity in terms of different states coordinating resources internally, dealing with issues of data, sharing of information, raising public awareness. Of course, Oklahoma, someone mentioned Ida's Law, and let me be accurate. That was Linda. Thank you, Linda. Ida's Law, and that's in Oklahoma. And let me get we got this here. And so reported April 2021, oklahoman.com. I'm sure there's varieties of the Oklahoman. I'm sure there's a variety of media reports where you can find these credible discussions. The governor signed bipartisan legislation for the state to seek federal funding so that they can address these issues of Indigenous Oklahomas. It's named after Ida Beard, missing since 2005. And this is a quote right from this article. And we mentioned this, one or two of us mentioned this early in this discussion tonight. And this is from the governor Stitt. Far too often when a Native person goes missing or is found murdered, their families have to navigate a complex checkerboard of jurisdictions, Stitt said. That confusion makes it so difficult on victims' families during what is already a traumatic time. So this bill, obviously, just the idea even of having pushing more collaboration and advocacy and awareness becomes an important issue. A lot of this you'll see at the state level. Linda, anything you want to add? Linda, you mentioned Ida's Law. Anything else you want to add about this? And I'm sharing this news report right now. Linda, anything you want to add on that? Okay. I'll keep going here too. There's some other, state level pages that we can see what's being done at the state level. I have here a page. I'm just giving examples. There are so many out there. I have New Mexico, right? Nothing else. Okay. Thank you, Linda. Thanks for mentioning that. New Mexico, Indian Affairs Department. And again, this is right from that state level database. The missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic is an issue currently affecting tribal communities and Indigenous people living in cities. And again, what did I say on the front end of the site of this episode? When we're thinking about Native American communities and missing persons, we're talking about on the reservation, but off the reservation. Back to North Dakota. When I moved to North Dakota, I lived in Bismarck for about 4 years, the capital, not on a reservation. But for instance, in Bismarck, North Dakota, there is a tribal college there, United Tribe Technical College. and it's just people that live there, right? It's the capital city. So you have various persons in some level or another, Native American, Indians. Other parts of, no, I moved to Western North Dakota in 2010. Now, I don't live on a reservation, but not too far. I don't know the exact time drive because not everything is a straight shot where I'm at. But we do have, another reservation northwest of here. And certainly when you get into Montana, South Dakota, okay, there are various reservation communities. So we're dealing with situations that are both on and off the reservation. So rightly noted there, and you'll see on that page that New Mexico, and this is just one example, right? And there are other examples. So when you start, you think back to the episode we did, why do people go missing, and other things we've discussed, all the sorts of things that overlap with missing persons cases. So we're talking about human trafficking. We're talking about domestic abuse issues, substance abuse issues. We've brought up some cultural issues and the ways in which those sorts of things might overlap with how missing persons are dealt with. Some of us talked about trust on and off reservation communities. And again, these are areas where academics and journalists, all these areas have spent some time. I'm not claiming any particular expertise here. I'm relating those things that are out there. We're talking about those sorts of things here, helpfully, that we might consider. As we know from our many discussions, that when you're thinking about covering, or whether from a journalism perspective or an awareness raising perspective, covering a particular case of someone who's gone missing, right? We've already established a framework or a roadmap of that. And we've thought about various ways already in which culture might play a role in understanding about how understanding a missing person's case could unfold. Okay, for sure. Okay, so that's New Mexico, right? That's one example. Okay. Keep going here. This is Washington State Patrol. So this would be the state police. Here's a site here. Now this is dealing with some particular avenues of information. But you can see through this the way in which they're framing or prioritizing issues of navigating missing persons information. They have on there, you can click a link. You would, again, hope that these sorts of things are updated regularly, and let's just, for the sake of discussion, hope that they are. But the information is the information. People can always follow up on that. But you can see even here when we're talking about, and we know, to some extent, the sort of political history of the, federal government of the United States, the various state governments of the United States, with the various tribal communities. And again, we're also dealing with folks that live off reservations, right? They're American folks. So, but like we said, we're grappling with various layers and levels of jurisdiction. But most importantly, we're seeing these things prioritized. So again, at the state level, and I'm not always dealing here with direct legislation per se, but even on the executive side of how certain things are carried out, interpreted, applied, in terms of law enforcement, resource usage, collaboration, coordination. One of the things that's important, this is again reported April 2021, apnews.com, and this does mention the Jermaine Charlo case in this article, actually. So that was something I had here and didn't make the connection. But just the discussion here about Justice Department collaborating with the various tribes on missing persons cases. So that's important. Right? You have to have that cooperation. in terms of actually solving these cases, and then of course raising awareness and prevention, for sure. While I'm walking through some of this prepared material, is there anything else that anyone wants to add? As always, we've covered some really important resources, and we've mentioned some cases, and we've walked through some legislative and even general governmental activities or approaches pertaining to missing persons, not only missing persons, but certainly areas that pertain to how, why people go missing, prevention of that. Anything that anyone else would like to add before we keep moving forward here? Okay. We know that when we find discussions both in media and academia, we're seeing a lot of discussions about, how resource allocation becomes a challenge. Obviously, resources can be scant anyway at times, and then how coordination of communication and information sharing become important for moving forward with reporting of these cases and collaboration among law enforcement, plus just the general issue of prevention. Obviously, they're trying to get folks within and outside of Native American communities more attentive to and more aware of these problems. So it's even at times not only studying the data, but even being able to gather the adequate data that's necessary to stay on top of these things. But as data is gathered, and then they're able to sort through some of this, right? We're seeing these trends and tendencies, where we're seeing these numbers tied to missing person situations in Native American communities. I'm just sharing some news pieces that deal with that, that are out there, and there's so many, right? And it's really a problem. The other thing we wanted to talk about tonight is, we've talked about organizations, we've talked about resources. What do we need to do? And of course, whether we're talking about raising awareness or actually solving cases, and whether that's journalistic perspective or if you're an advocate in the community to get more people thinking about this, how do we get more people involved in these conversations pertaining to missing persons in Native American communities? And any of us, please, I have some of my own ideas about this, but if there's anything that anyone thinks we ought to do, Linda, Delane, any of us, please, what do we do to get more people involved? I know this is something we always sort of go back to, but it is important, right? Just like prevention, we're trying to engage in collaboration, right? Collaboration. Since our second episode, we've been talking about collaboration is key. Well, if you want more people to collaborate, more people have to be involved. If you want more awareness, more people have to be involved. Okay, Linda, unfortunately, the tribal councils need to accept outside help. That's true. So communication-wise, rhetorically, and I've not studied this issue, but I'm a communications professor. I study public argument, debate, persuasion, classical rhetoric, political rhetoric, and so forth. This is an interesting one. This would be one to study, and I know people are dealing with this in terms of media and even academia. I do think, probably activists, political people who are actually in politics, who care about the issues, right? This is a good one, right? How do we get people to build those bridges internally and externally in Native American communities to get that two-way street so that people know where the help is from and be able to accept the outside help? Now, it seems like, based on the various discussions of legislation and advocacy and awareness raising, and not that it's always pretty and not that it's sometimes not tense or messy, that there seems to be some movement or in the direction of at least people on the reservations, not necessarily the tribal councils all the time, but maybe there's a shift there too, of some valuing of the importance of that collaboration. Now, I don't know enough and have not studied that particular question enough to say for sure, but Linda, that's a very important area. How do we get people who are in the mix, inside and outside of the Native American communities, to accept the help, provide the help, collaborate, etc.? Good thought. Other thoughts along these lines? Okay, I know for my part, and I always say even what I could do more of, so I know I should be doing more of this. And it seems small, and it is in a way compared to people who are actually out doing search parties and advocating in front of community councils and so forth. But just something as basic as, like earlier tonight, right? I sent some URLs from the FBI website that have the overview of the cases, posters if someone wants to make it. You don't necessarily have to run to those communities if you're not near it. But boy, why I should say to myself, why am I not sharing that information more? Not just, obviously on social media, email to just various persons I'm in contact with, and then just word of mouth. Okay, LaFour, give as much attention to the brown and black missing as they do blue-eyed blondes. Now, again, this is an important discussion. It gets into some very delicate philosophical and political issues. That's okay. Again, we're not necessarily always going to agree on everything specifically, but I think we all should agree, as you're rightly pointing to, let's give all the missing persons cases attention. Certainly in the world of media, and we've discussed this here, folks, in previous episodes, right? In the world of media, academically, professionally, everyday citizens, certainly there's always this discussion about how and why media outlets give prioritization to certain types of cases. Certainly you can have these discussions with respect to law enforcement too, I guess. But again, as I always say, notwithstanding our political views, similar or different, yes, we need to giving attention to missing persons cases across the board as best we can. As best we can. So let's do that. And let's be committed to that. There's so many communities across the country where we can be sharing the information and raising the awareness. Linda, because they are a sovereign nation, we can't really do anything. They are the lowest socioeconomical class in the U.S., more prone to isolation, which increases violence. It's a vicious cycle. So, Linda, you're getting into the socioeconomic and cultural issues. Of course, the tribal communities do have sovereignty. Of course, they are also in treaty or collaboration or other sorts of agreements. And I'm no expert on tribal law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a person who studies that from any discipline, but I'm aware of some of it. Certainly even living in a region like up here. So there are things in place, right, that would allow there to be some collaboration through agreement and discussion. And, we have folks, Indian folks and non-Indian folks, always crossing various jurisdictions. And so, of course, then we have to figure out ways to do collaboration. But Linda, you mentioned a political reality. Also, Linda, I read 6 out of 10 violent crimes are not reported. I suspect you mean on Native American communities or within those communities. Okay, that's an issue. How do we then... And this obviously is something that has to start locally at the tribal level. And so how do we get more folks to be reporting violent crimes? That's an interesting question. And whether that starts at the family level or the community level, of course, as we do know, some of the, just like in inner city urban areas, we do know that, and it's just not even inner city urban areas, there's certain things that go on in rural areas too, but also in reservation communities, they are running into issues of gang violence and drug activity and intimidation. Similar to what we've talked about, excuse me, in one or more episodes in terms of how people navigate relationships with law enforcement, right? So we're getting into some very important issues here. I know I was talking about something basic, which again, not necessarily, we don't necessarily solve the world's problems when we're doing things on social media. But I can say, I can say that if we do have the opportunity to share information that's valuable, that's credible about specific missing persons cases, then that's somewhere we can start. Maybe even getting read up and even get into some of the debates about these cultural issues that were socioeconomic and political issues. Maybe as you're all mentioning outstanding areas of consideration, maybe we all ought to challenge each other to get a more nuanced understanding of these sorts of things. And I know folks are going to be watching this after the fact, and hopefully in your own learning about these issues, we develop some of that cultural appreciation that we've talked about in other episodes, for sure. I'm not going to get into every nuance here of it, an academic discussion, but maybe in the future when we talk more about media. But certainly scholars of communication, mass communication in particular, certainly do, look into and study and discuss ways in which people deal with solving problems and how media impacts and influences the perceived and or actual solvings of problems. And we have to be measured then on how we think about the media and social media, media activity in general, social in particular nowadays, really puts us on the pulse of an issue. But if we take a measured approach to that, we all can do different things, right? Some of us are able to be out in the community. Some of us are able to do search work. Some are able to go out and do whatever. But a lot of times, if we're going to be spending time on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, as we've said before, well, we might as well be sharing important material. So let's continue to raise awareness about those cases. I know that I'm going to, challenge myself to do more about that, for sure. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, which we always do, which is very appreciated. Again, the think tank folks continue to provide ideas, feedback, participation. Some, number of folks watch these after the fact when Natasha and Ed make these publicly available. And so just as always, to summarize as we go through our material that we discussed, does anyone want to offer any last thoughts, any summary thoughts, anything that you wanted to add before we conclude? And I'll start, going through again. As always, if you're watching this, please go to theunfoundpodcast.com. That's the website for everything Unfound. Ed and Natasha really does a lot of the technical work, but Ed and Natasha working together, the whole team, of course, between the Facebook activity and Ed's podcast and the live show and the think tank, and of course here Unfound on the ground, we can see it's an important effort overall. And so please go to theunfoundpodcast.com. Tonight we've posted a number of important reference links, resource pages. Over time, the data gems will be updated, but we have a running list of references and resources in the chat. When you're replaying the video, you will see these in the chat, the live chat. That opportunity there is basically then like a digital recording as a visual. As I'm concluding here, if anyone has anything else to say, please go ahead and type as we summarize. We've covered a number of important issues tonight tied to the Native American communities. Again, thanks to Delane in our last episode when we were talking about legislative and governmental activities. Delane had mentioned Native American communities. Of course, this is an issue or set of issues that's on our minds a lot, but that put it at the forefront, and certainly I wanted to have that on the list of things that we're going to cover in episodes. Okay, Linda, I know the question of why Gabby got so much attention has been asked. One thing I think was that she was actively on social media. People noticed her missing. Again, this is very important. It's an issue of legitimate controversy. Um, people of goodwill can get into some of these issues about that, but it is true. There's no doubt that that case, did certainly raise discussion and awareness, and certainly you can see a range of discussions out there in media, particularly in places like Wyoming, where there are a number of persons that go missing, white, non-white, etc., Native American. How does a specific case get so much attention? I think there's a variety of legitimate factors to consider for that, such as how visible that person might have been and so forth. But regardless of those sorts of things, we know that we should be committed. Let's raise as much awareness as we can about missing persons in general as much as possible. But I think that's an important discussion. Anyone else want to say anything else to summarize or mention before we finish up? The main reason was because she was a pretty white girl. And again, that's a viewpoint that's expressed out there. And there's a lot of nuance in that discussion. For the purposes of this episode, I'm not going to jump into the guts of that discussion. Certainly, folks, please do think about that on your own. But for our episode, I'm going to say, hey, it's important that we can see the big picture of these issues as they overlap and mesh, while still encouraging all of us to do what we can, regardless of race, ethnicity, geography, all the usual categories. Let's get as interested as we can in learning about and advocating and bringing awareness to, advocating for, trying to solve various missing persons cases. Anything else that anyone want to mention before we wind down? Again, this will be coming out. We're doing about one episode a month now. And so soon, at some point in the next couple of weeks, I'll mention the next theme. This is number 13. So great work, folks. Appreciate all the activity and the ideas that the think tank folks have been giving. As you know, with the Unfound View, what Ed's committed to, what we're all committed to, right? Accuracy, doing the best we can in terms of facts and evidence. And then if we have different ideas about cases, having as much strong grounding as possible for thinking through those possibilities and making sure that public record, even when certain things are under dispute, right, that the best conversations are being had about these cases. So we're always talking about things that could pertain to journalism or advocacy or awareness with regard to missing persons cases. Okay, folks, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate what a great discussion tonight. Please continue to stay with us on these Unfound on the Ground episodes. I'll be updating in the weeks ahead about the next episode. Again, the unfoundpodcast.com. Yes, thanks to all of you, and you're welcome. And thanks to everyone. I always end with this. Besides a great thank you to everyone that's involved, I always do say my idea that I always reiterate: someone out there knows something when we're talking about these cases, or knows someone who knows something. This concludes Unfound on the Ground number 13, Missing Persons in Native American Communities. Thank you to all.